Greetings, heroes. It is I, your friendly neighborhood rabbi, John Carrier. And today, this is exciting for me. We're doing a live recording of the Jew Curious Show. This is a podcast that I started last summer. We got about 20 episodes in. And today, I would like to do a live recording of this podcast as I take questions from the audience. I want to present some ideas, some Jewish ideas about God, and some things that we've been learning in the Jew Curious School. So if you see up on the splash page here, there are a couple of resources that I want to mention before we get started. One, if the word Jew Curious describes you, you could be Jewish, you could be just Jew Curious. There's some people who watch my videos and listen to the podcast who are a completely different religion, but they're curious about Jewish stuff. There are some people who are so curious they're considering converting to Judaism. And there are some people who've been Jewish their whole life, but they're curious to know more about it. Maybe they had a bar mitzvah, and that's the last time they were in a synagogue 10 or 30 or 50 years ago. So if this sounds like you, I've got a great guide for you. It's called 3 Things Jew Curious People Need to Upgrade Your Jewish Learning Experience. And you can find that down in the comments to this video, down in the show notes, I guess you will, in podcast terms. And you just click the link and you can get that right away. If you'd like to jump in and learn with us live every single week, we've got at least 3 classes going every single week where you can learn with us live. I'm going to give some shout outs to my friends Vanessa and Teresa. Vanessa is joining us from Poland today, and Teresa is joining us from Cyprus. So excited to have some Jew Curious regulars on here, but everybody's welcome. I was about to say, these are people who are in the Jew Curious School. This is a school where we get together several times a week to learn the weekly Torah portion. People learn some subject. Right now, we're teaching a series about the Torah and Torah study. And in the last couple of weeks, we have started an Introduction to Judaism class. And so that's going to cover a whole big, wide range of things. And some people who are preparing for conversion might want to take that class to satisfy the educational component. It's not an online conversion program like watch 10 videos, click a button, download a certificate, lie down in your bathtub as a mikvah. It's not that. But it's a full-blown Introduction to Judaism class. I've been teaching a class like this for several years now. And about 20 years ago, I took a class like this myself. So, if you want to take this kind of class from somebody who has been there and has asked way dumber questions than you could possibly think of, I don't know, maybe, challenge me. But so if you want to learn with somebody who gets it, this might be a good way to learn for you. So there's a link to that in the description below. And I'm just going to switch this off so you can see my full apartment background. It's my kid's room over there. There's a picture that, what is on this side? This side? This side. That's a picture that my son took in photography class 10 years ago. But it's from back when we lived in Minnesota by the lakes. So anyway, that's enough about me. That's enough about the resources that you can download. Let's talk about what we're here to talk about today, and that is God. And so when I started teaching the Introduction to Judaism program within the Jew Curious School, I decided to start with the subject of God because God is first, right? Like God was there before there was anything else. In the first subject in the sentence, Bereshit bara Elohim, God began to create the world. So God comes before anything else. God comes, let's say, 20 generations before Judaism, because after Adam there was 10 generations, and then there was Noah, and then after Noah there was 10 generations, and then there was this guy named Avram that God formed a special bond with. And Avraham, later Avraham or Abraham, his descendants became what is now the Jewish people. So well before there were any Jewish people, there was God. And so we're going to start there. And to have an understanding, we're going to talk about who God is in the Jewish understanding. And there are several different Jewish understandings. As I've said in this channel before, there's almost no single answer to the question, what does Judaism say about X or Y or Z. You can find a number of opinions, but because we've been talking about the most important things in the world for 3,000-4,000 years. So over that time, a variety of opinions have emerged. And so we're going to talk today about some consensus opinions about the nature of God within the Jewish tradition. But first, we're going to call on another Jewish tradition, and that's one that was really well encapsulated by Maimonides about 1,000 years ago, give or take, a little bit less than 1,000 years ago. Don't want to make him too old. He's a pretty handsome man if you've seen the photographs. But he had this different idea of it was not that different. It was sort of a Greek notion that it's impossible to say who or what God is. Instead, Maimonides championed this idea that you can really only say true things about God in the negative. And that doesn't mean, you should go around saying negative things about God. I don't recommend it. But sort of negative definition. You can't say what God is. You can only say what God isn't, because those kinds of statements are limited by human language, by human imagination. So, if we said God was blue, then that's saying, well, God's not red, God's not yellow, that's omnicolored, maybe. But even that is limited by our own language and our imagination. So we can only say what God isn't. Like, God isn't a single color. God isn't, very important to Maimonides, God isn't corporeal, right? God doesn't have a body in the sense that we think of as bodies. Even though in the text it has things like, God rescued the Hebrews from Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. That's a metaphor, according to Maimonides. That's sort of human imaginings of how God operates based on our own limited capacity for sensation and experience. It's useful for us as a way of understanding something that transcends human understanding. But you can't say with certainty that God has a body or a shape or a size or a color or a smell or anything accessible by the human senses, because that would not do justice to what God may actually be. Right? You can't say that God is really limited in any. So one thing that we can say is God is not limited by human understanding. Right? For Maimonides, we can't even say that God is omnipotent, because the human understanding of the word omnipotence, even though it means sort of infinitely powerful, can't even do justice to the power contained, if you will, by God's essence. And so Maimonides, a careful, rational, logical philosopher, said you could only really say true things about what God isn't. Everything else we're just kind of grasping, right? That being said, although I want to go back for a second to the notion of corporeality, because God being incorporeal, or not having a body in the sense that we think of as bodies, is critical to our, I'll say, departure from idolatry. If you say that God has a body that can be described or have an image created of it, then you can have a tendency toward idolatry, to make a statue in the shape of God, for example, or make a painting of God. Sometimes we have some beautiful paintings from the Renaissance of God and Adam communicating with each other, and there's an actual picture of God. There's a big guy in a cloud with a long white beard and crazy hair, right? God can do God's hair however God wants, but even, Maimonides would say God doesn't have hair, so stop it right there, John. We don't talk that often, but I'm just using my imagination there. But these are human imaginings so that we can relate to this being that we want to be in communication with, that we want to have an interface with. But we can't look at those images and say that those images are either God themselves or represent God accurately. And so, if there's one thing that there's a limited set of things that we as Jews agree on, but God's incorporeality is part of it. So I want to hit on some other very important things that we've got some consensus around in the Jewish tradition. And one of those things is that God is one, right? Essential to the Jewish relationship with God, the Jewish understanding of God, is that God is not multiple. There's, again, that negative definition. God is, maybe the word one in human language doesn't completely capture the essence of God, but we can say with some certainty that God's not multiple, right? So this oneness, this unity, this unitary nature of God is essential to Jewish religion. As one of my rabbis once said, the only thing that all Jews can agree on is that there is at most one God. Right? There's plenty of Jewish atheists out there. I used to be one, as a matter of fact. But we even if you don't acknowledge the existence of God, you won't say that I don't believe in God that's two gods or three or four gods. So essential to Jewish religious practice and belief is that God is one, right? And that's baked into the Shema. This is sort of one of the central Jewish prayers. It's the first prayer that children learn when they're little. It's one of the first prayers that potential converts learn how to say and then say when it's time for their Beit Din and their mikvah, and they come up out of the water of the mikvah, now newly Jewish, but as Jewish as if they were Jewish the day they were born. And the first thing that they say after emerging out of the mikveh traditionally is the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Right? Listen up, Israel. Listen up, these people who are descendants of one who wrestles with the divine. That's what Yisrael means. Listen up, Yisrael, because it's listen in the imperative. God is our God, meaning not exclusively ours. This is, if there's one God, it's the God for everybody. However, that means that we don't have any other gods besides this God. That's what, Adonai is our God means. And then finally, Adonai Echad, God is one. Some people may have pause just to explain a few things on this stream. Yes, I am Jewish, and yet I spell out, the name God as a handle or a pointer to this concept of God that is not limited by human speech. There are tons of Jews out there who spell the word God G-D, and that's a legitimate approach. That's expressing that, we don't know the name of God. We're very careful with the name of God. We have a tradition that if you write the name of God on a piece of paper, that you can't treat that like any other piece of paper, right? You can't throw it in the trash or wad it up or God forbid, erase it. And so people are very careful about how they write the name of God. My philosophy that I take from some of my rabbis is that the word spelled G-O-D is so far removed from God's actual name, if we could imagine it, that it is not Shem Kodesh. It's not something that we have to be careful with. And also, when I say the Shema, I say it with the words, as we say in prayer, L'Shem Hinuch. That means for the sake of education. Some people will when teaching, will say Shema Hashem, Elokeinu, making sort of substitutions so as not to approach desecrating the name of God. However, I would rather teach you how to say it accurately for when you are in prayer spaces. So just want to explain that for people who are a little bit uncomfortable about how I use the name of God. It is, a Jewish tradition to teach these things so that people can learn them without obfuscating them any further than we have to. So back to the concept that God is one. Okay, very, very important. Another aspect of God that there is some consensus in Jewish liturgy, Jewish prayer, and Jewish thought is that God is what we call transcendent, right? This is sort of a philosophical, technical term. This means that God is beyond everything, or it's beyond beyondness, if you will, beyond Beyonce even. That's saying something. So God is beyond everything. God transcends human reality, transcends the human plane, right? Some say that God is infinitely large. The word large doesn't even, approach God's extension, right? God's intelligence transcends human intelligence. God's power, God's capacity for goodness transcends the human capacity for goodness, right? And this also means that God is distant from us, right? It's like you can't reach out and touch God. In the Hebrew Bible, you can't, it was said you couldn't see God, otherwise things got terribly dangerous for you. There was a moment where Moshe asked to see God's face, and God said, "No human can see my face and live." So that gives an idea of some of the transcendence. Like you can't comprehend God and keep your brains intact, right? Because you would just be so blown away, figuratively and literally, that you could no longer exist. So that gives us an idea of God's transcendence. And if you go into holy space, and that's not just a Jewish idea, that's shared by many religions. And if you go into a synagogue, many synagogues, especially in the United States, that have some architecture that is similar to church architecture, but especially if you go into like European Christian cathedrals, you'll notice the architecture draws your eye forward and up, right? And the idea is that architecture is there to communicate the transcendence of God. You actually perceive distance, you perceive height, and the space is designed to engender that perception of God's transcendence. A complement to that, the other side of the coin, is that at the same time, Jewish liturgy, thought, tradition, philosophy, etc., recognizes what's called the imminence of God. Imminence, right? The imminence of God means that God is not, just infinitely distant, but also infinitely close, right? The imminence means that God's presence pervades human experience, pervades, the corporeal world. It's completely infused in everything. I think maybe I'm using this term incorrectly, but it's the idea of panentheism, right? Not only is God everywhere, but God, in an outward sense, but also in an inward sense. That God is present in every molecule of our being, and that God is close to us, and that God cares, that God is active in the world. A transcendent God, or let's say a simply transcendent God, is not involved in human affairs necessarily because we're so far beneath that God. But, as Maimonides might say, that God doesn't play by your rules of transcendence. God can be transcendent and immanent, infinitely close, infinitely involved at the very same time. And so these two things are kind of hard to hold in your head at the same time. Surpassing transcendence and surpassing immanence. However, that's kind of God's prerogative, that God can be transcendent and immanent at the same time. And I find this very powerful personally because, sometimes when I pray, I need a transcendent God. Let's say I've got some kind of challenge in front of me that I'm really at a loss to deal with myself. I don't have the strength. I don't have the patience. I don't have the intelligence. That's my fear. I don't have the capacity to solve this problem myself. So when I'm praying to borrow, if you will, some strength from a stronger being. Right? I need to, sometimes I was like, look, I don't know if I'm wise enough to deal with this problem, but I know you are, God, so let's work on this together, right? Lend me some of that wisdom. Guide my hand, guide my reasoning so that together with your transcendent capacity, we can solve something that feels greater than my capacity to deal with it, right? A transcendent God is terribly, if I could say this in a properly reverent way, a transcendent God is terribly handy sometimes, right? We need a God that's bigger than us, that surpasses our understanding, because sometimes we need to borrow that strength. It was a simple, maybe does it injustice. This is a simple way that I put it. But sometimes when I'm praying, I need a God that is close, right? I need a God that isn't distant from me because I need a hand. I need a shoulder to cry on. I need a friend to talk to when I'm completely alone. And I need to feel God's presence in my life. Sometimes, bad things are happening, or we're experiencing a loss, or we're afraid and we're lonely, and we need something present. And I trust that this transcendent God is also a present and imminent God in my life. And and I'm not going to lie to you, it's hard to balance those things. It's hard to hold those two ideas in your mind at the same time. But think of your friends, right? And again, Maimonides would say, God's not your friend in the sense of, friend on Facebook. God's beyond that. But as a metaphor, think of the friends in your life. Like sometimes, sometimes you need to talk to a friend who's far away, right? Sometimes, when we were in Minnesota, before I came to rabbinical school, I needed to make a friend with somebody in California who could check out my apartment for me before I signed the lease, before I could move in, because I only had one move-in day. And sometimes you need a friend who's distant. Sometimes you need a friend who's there with chicken soup, right? I just want to take a pause here to give some shout outs. Shout out to Dave from Tucson, Arizona. Shout out to Jessica Cohen from Boca Raton, Florida. Really grateful for the people who are learning with me today. I'll take also a little pause to go into a question Vanessa asks. Maimonides would never say that there is one God, but rather that there isn't more than one God. So I'll say yes in a philosophical. So let's say if Maimonides is praying the Shema, Maimonides is probably wherever Maimonides is now. If Maimonides was praying the Shema, Maimonides would say Adonai Echad. So in that sense, Maimonides would say that God is one. But if Maimonides is writing a philosophical treatise on the nature of God, he would pause and say, well, I can't really say that God is one, because one is, just an Arabic numeral or a finger on your hand, which doesn't capture God's unity fully. But God would say, the one thing that we can agree on is that God is not multiple. There is not more than one God. So again, balancing. Sometimes we have to think immanent. Sometimes we have to think transcendent. Sometimes we're praying, and sometimes we're thinking. And those two aren't mutually exclusive, but sometimes they use different language. So I hope that helps a little bit. Maimonides was a complicated dude in many ways. I was brought to a teaching this week. Some people have problems with Maimonides because he writes some things about Kuthites, or were probably Ethiopians, that people say, I can't learn with Maimonides because Maimonides is a racist. That's maybe a topic for another discussion. So some people can hang with Maimonides, some people can't. I like to think that we can pick some ideas, or at least say that these are some representative ideas in Judaism, without saying that every single thing that Maimonides said was representative of Judaism. So I just want to pause there because somebody made me aware of that trigger that some people have around Maimonides. So we've talked about what God isn't. God isn't limited or corporeal. We've talked about some Jewish some Jewish, try this one more time, this fun of live broadcasting. We have some Jewish consensus that God is one, that God is transcendent, and that God is immanent. And I was talking about architecture a second ago. There are some prayer spaces that are designed with transcendence in mind. There are also some prayer spaces with God's immanence in mind. I'll say for a good chunk of the last millennium, at least, of European synagogues, the prayer space was sort of structured not facing forward in rigid pews. That's more of an American Protestant architecture. But they were sort of in the round, where the place where the prayer leader would stand was in the middle of the room, and the Torah reading table, when they take the Torah out to read it, was in the middle of the room, and everybody sort of surrounded it. And when it was time to, say the Aleinu or the Amidah or something where we pray facing towards the east, everybody would be facing in the same direction. But in other modes of prayer and in Torah study, everybody sort of faced each other. And this human immanence, if you will, this feeling of presence between people where you can look other people in the face and not just at the back of their heads, gives us a small sense of God's immanence. When people feel present with each other, I believe philosopher Martin Buber would agree, when people feel connected to each other, that feeling of connection includes godliness, includes the Shekhinah, includes the presence of God. And so sometimes, once again, we need a transcendent God in our lives. Sometimes we need an immanent God in our life. Luckily, we have one God that captures both of these polarities simultaneously. And so this brings up another discussion we had in the Jew Curious show this week, or excuse me, the Jew Curious school, when we were talking about God, is that each of us can have a different understanding of God, a different way of looking at God, thinking about God, and those can all be true, and simultaneously we could be talking about the same God, right? I have a view of God shaped by my own experience. I'm not saying that God is shaped by my own experience, but my experience of God, how I think about God, how I talk to God, is shaped by my history, my experience. God the Father image doesn't work for everybody because God is not limited by gender or familial relationship. But I've been a father for longer in my life that I haven't been. So I get fatherhood, right? So that's sometimes I think of God as a father because fatherhood means something to me, and it's a metaphor for understanding. Somebody else could relate to God in an entirely different way, as a mother figure or as a sister or as a bestie, and that, God can be a bestie. I'm just going to go out and say that. You can tweet me on that if you like. But we can have a very different language for God, but we could be talking about the same God because God can encompass all of those ideas. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about what God isn't. We've talked about who God is to the Jewish people. And I want to kind of take a little bit of a break, show you some things that are going on in the Jew Curious community. If you've just joined us, if we get disconnected for any reason, we have a couple of handy things here. One is a downloadable guide, 3 things that Jew Curious people need to upgrade their Jewish learning experience. That guide is available down below. If you just click the link, it's the 3 things guide. Some things that I think when you're approaching Jewish learning can be very terribly helpful to you in taking your learning to the next level. And when you get to that next level, another thing that I have access to is this community called the Jew Curious School. And that is a school in which we've got a thriving community. There's about 36 or so students in there right now. And people are talking to each other. People are supporting each other. People are asking questions. And I'm jumping in and answering questions. But I love it when the students jump in and answer questions as well. And people are really supporting each other on their journey. I think one of the best moments for me in that community was there was a member who I think is in Toronto said, "Hey, I'm going to a synagogue for the first time." And I'm a little nervous about that. What should I wear? Like, how do I act? Should I talk to anybody or not? And we had people jumping in the comments from Alaska, from Germany, from Australia, and from, California is not so bad either, and from Florida saying, "Go you, high five. You should totally go do that. Don't sweat it. Don't be nervous. Dress like dress in a dignified, like giving her tips, right? And then asking her how it was afterwards, right? So even though we're scattered all over the globe, people are really supporting each other in their Jewish spiritual journey. In addition to that sort of always on community, we have 3 live classes a week. There's a weekly Parshat HaShavua class. It's a Torah portion of the week. There's a class usually on a topic. I do a series, like a 4-week series on a certain topic. Today we're actually wrapping up the series on Torah and Torah study. And there is a weekly class that's an Introduction to Judaism class where we talk about a variety of different topics related to Judaism. It's geared toward people who are studying for conversion, but anybody can participate. And all 3 of those classes every week are archived, which means that anytime you want to jump into the community, you can learn everything that we've been learning together for the last 3 months or so at your own pace, on your own schedule, which really helps with our time zone disparity that we have in the Jew Curious School. So just wanted to mention that in case you're just joining us. Now, one more thing I want to talk about relating to God before we conclude today, and that is what God. So we've talked about who God isn't, or what God isn't, who God is, at least in some Jewish consensus. And now I want to talk about what God does. So in sort of various modes of Jewish philosophy, there are sort of three primary things that we talk about God doing. And one of those things, I'll just give you all three, then we'll get into them. One is God creates, right? That's the first verb you see in the Torah, Bereshit bara, right? In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, or created the heavens and the earth. And so we talk about God as a source of creation, as a creative being who set the world in motion. And some people take that very literally. Some people take it more figuratively. And some people have a hard time with the concept of God creating because we have a geological record and we have astronomical theories, and we say, well, it wasn't 6 days less than 6,000 years ago. It was the world, Earth as we think of it, sort of became a sphere about 4.5 billion years ago. And, we have fossil records going back, probably a billion, or some speculate maybe 4 billion years. I don't know when the first microcellular organisms came into being. But it's hard to say that God, some people can't take a look at what's in the Torah and take that literally. Although, if you look at the order of the 6 days of creation, they tend to track with the orders of things in the Big Bang Theory and the geological record and the ecological or biological, paleontological record of the order in which different species of life came into being. And even the rabbis of the Talmud said that they weren't taking this 6-day thing literally in the sense of 6 periods of 24, hours or 6 sun cycles. And they just said, look, maybe God's days aren't like our days, right? Maybe these are, again, a limited human metaphor. And we're just talking that way 2,000 years ago. And so, again, some people find it useful to say, okay, no, God created the earth in 6 periods, 6 sunrises and sunsets. You do you. I'll say I have a more scientific view, but my God is big enough to encompass that as well. But we say that God creates, and there are some views of sort of deistic views that God created the world once and then set it in motion, and then left the scene. Right? God is this sort of watchmaker that winds it up and lets it go and doesn't interfere ever again. Some people see God's presence in the ongoing creation, just the orders of things, how fossils form, how rock formations form, how glaciers move. People can see God's kind of hand in that, whether that was initiating it or continuing to, push it. But in any case, another concept within Judaism is the partnership between God and humanity in creation, that we are in being stewards of God's creation, as they kind of set the scene in the Garden of Eden, that we were supposed to, take care of everything. We're not just, taking the baton and running with it. We're actually partners in the ongoing creation of the world that continues to unfold in each moment. And so what we can say is that a common consensus of what God does is God creates. Another thing that God does is God reveals, right? God reveals God's intention to humans in the world, right? God revealed God's self to Adam and Eve. Right? God said, hey, I'm God, and we're going to talk about something. God talked to Adam and Eve. God talked to Cain after Cain slew his brother. God talked to Noah and said, hey, build a boat because there's rain coming. God talked to Avram and then told him to change his name to Abraham a little bit after that. And also kind of made a covenant. So God continues, at least in our scripture, God continues to reveal God's self in what seems to be a very literal way. And then at some point, God stopped talking to humans, and at least if you follow the canon, God started speaking through humans, right? God speaks to humans through the prophets. Once we get into the Nevi'im, when we have the prophet Samuel and the prophet Nathan, God is communicating to the kings, the early Hebrew kings, through prophets. And then after that, we have Isaiah, and we have Jeremiah, and we have Ezekiel, and these different people who are speaking sort of on God's behalf. They have nevuah. They have some sort of insight into the mind of God. Sometimes they're given dreams. Sometimes they're given wisdom or reason. And that then God is revealed through them. At some point, our rabbis agreed that prophecy stopped, right? And now we reveal God through studying Torah, through the discussions of rabbis, through the arguments of rabbis, through the arguments of Jews who aren't rabbis, because most Jews aren't. And yet it's completely legitimate for two people to sit and study Torah and come up with two different perspectives that reveal an aspect of the will of God, right? So we go through different stages of revelation. We have this personal revelation between, let's say, God and Abraham. We have this collective public revelation in the book of Exodus, in Parshat Yitro, in the revelation of the Ten Commandments, where that's the one time where God sort of talks to everybody where they could hear God. And then God goes back to talking to Moses and Aaron for a while. And then God speaks through prophets. And now, an article of my own faith is that God speaks through human beings who study Torah together and who reason together and who are sometimes argue together, but come up with a discernment of God's will through studying Torah, through studying the prophets, through studying the rabbis. So I think it's possible that God's revelation continues into the future as long as there are people in earnest pursuit of God's wisdom. So God creates, God reveals in private, in public, vicariously, and now through our own God-given capacity of study and reason. And then the final thing in this kind of triptych is God redeems, right? God, one word is saves, right? God redeems, not like you redeem a coupon or something like that, but in the sense of redeeming a captive, in the sense of, ransoming somebody who's been kidnapped, in the sense of freeing someone from slavery. So God redeems us when we're in a dark place, when we're in a place of captivity, whether that's literal captivity like in Egypt, or let's say spiritual captivity. We're stuck. We're depressed. We can't figure out a way out of our situation. By studying Torah, by praying, by meditating on God's nature, we can free ourselves, or rather invite God to free us from that situation, right? We have some textual examples are the one that's most present because we have a big dinner about it every year, that's Passover, is God redeeming the slaves in Egypt. God remembered the covenant that God made with Abraham and said, okay, Abraham's we'll say great-great-grandchildren are in Egypt. Remember that covenant? Hey, Moses, I need your help with something. I don't need your help, but, it's you can, help out if you want to. Very forceful argument, the burning bush. God came and with Moses and Aaron's accompaniment redeemed the slaves in Egypt, through plagues and through miracles and through active, let's say, imminent participation in the world, right? Some say that God redeemed us in the Babylonian exile through the hand of Cyrus the Great. We were exiled by the Assyrians to Babylonia. Cyrus took power and said, okay, all you Jews can go back to Jerusalem. And so we see Cyrus, not as a prophet, but as a leader who was an agent of God's redemption of that original exile. And in our prayers for the last 2,000 years, until the advent of the modern state of Israel, we have been praying for God's redemption from diaspora, from being scattered all over the world and literally not allowed to go back to the promised land. And many people see the advent of the modern day state of Israel as a redemptive, as God redeeming us and bringing us back together. So again, this is an aspect of God's imminence. God is active in the world. And not every Jew agrees about this. Again, these are sort of consensus items. Some see that that divine inspiration in human activity, in people working to create the state of Israel or wrest ourselves from captivity. And it's possible to see that human ingenuity and that human power either being inspired, influenced, or set in motion by God as a redemptive act. So we've talked about who God isn't. God's not corporeal or limited by human imagination. We've talked about some consistency or some consensus. Still can't. Yeah, it's a terrible word for me. I guess I need to build some consensus about how to pronounce it. We've talked about some consensus ideas in Judaism that God is one, and that one is at the same time transcendent and immanent. And now that we know who we're talking about, we say, what is this God doing in the world? And we can say that through the course of human history, through the course of our relationship with God, God has created, and some say continues to create. God has revealed God's intention to us through conversations with our forefathers, but also through public conversations, as in the giving of the Ten Commandments, and through inspiring prophets and showing up when two people are studying Torah together. That is God's revelation. And finally, God's redemption is God redeemed humanity by picking Noah, right? By saying, okay, I'm not going to wipe you out altogether, and I'm never going to send a flood like that again. But you could say that God redeemed humanity by starting over with Noah to a certain extent. God redeemed a great, a family that started with one guy or two, a guy and his wife, Avram and Sarai. God redeemed humanity from idolatry, from worship of limited things, by revealing God's oneness to Avram, and then created a relationship, and later, physically redeemed Hebrews from captivity in Egypt, and then continues to kind of be our strength and sometimes our inspiration, and sometimes our divine hand when we need saving throughout history. So that's a lot of stuff that we've talked about today. I really appreciate everybody doing this learning with me. I've kind of been talking along for a while, and so I'm going to go to some of the questions in the comments. We have some people just really curious as to why I'm not recognizing Jesus in this conversation. So I'll say, I'm a rabbi. I'm not an expert in Christianity nor a follower of that. So today I'm here to talk about the Jewish views of those things. And I'm not here to teach about Christianity, which I don't follow or preach. So we're talking about the Jewish view of God. What other questions do people have about God in the Jewish tradition? So I'll hang around here for a second, answer any questions that people have. In the meantime, I'll just refer you just one more time. It's not like an infomercial, but in case these are resources that are helpful for you, want to share with you the guide that you can download. There are links to both of these things below. There's a guide called 3 Things Jew-Curious People Need to Upgrade Your Jewish Learning. There's a link to that below. It's rabbijohncarrier.com/3 things. These are 3 things that I found terribly helpful in my own journey, and I think are very helpful in other people beginning their journey or anywhere along the journey where people can really upgrade the quality of their learning with these 3 things. And once you are upgraded, once you are ready to just dive in on a regular basis, we have the Jew Curious School, where there's dozens of people in there right now. There's sort of an active community forum where people can share what they're learning with each other, where people can ask questions to a rabbi who gets it, who came in from the outside, who became Jewish about 19 years ago this summer. So that just means whatever questions you've had, man, I've probably had them too, and worse. Or there's no question that you can ask me that's a dumb question or an embarrassing question because I've been there, right? I get you. So that's one aspect. But also, people are there to support each other. There's a lot of people on the same path, whether they're Jewish, not